Hello, I am Angela Barzanti. Today we will be discussing Lawrence Augusta Oxley. Lawrence was a social worker that worked alongside with President Roosevelt to help African Americans with public welfare. He was born in Massachusetts, 1887, and died in 1973. He eventually married Mamie Elizabeth Hill and had two daughters. In this time period, African Americans were still fighting for equal rights and representation in the government. Luckily, Lawrence came to help African Americans to have a voice in the government. During his young life, he attended public schools in Boston and Cambridge. Then he studied at Harvard, where he joined the first African American fraternity. Later, he joined the U.S. Army during World War I. During World War I, he was promoted from private to first lieutenant. He was a special investigator for the infantry moral branch of the War Department Commission on the training camp activities for Negro troops. 1919 to 1941, he became on the Reserve Commission. Then later, he became an active member of the American Legion. After studying at Harvard, he traveled to different states, working in different communities to help African Americans get out of poverty and find jobs. By doing this local community work, he became the director of the Division of Work Among Negroes. As director, he had to document social problems that African Americans face and try to solve them at a state level. He began his social work career in North Carolina in 1925, promoting education and training to African Americans through public welfare. He encouraged African Americans to engage in community service and become leaders in their own community. He was an instructor at St. Augustine's College, which is historically a black college, which is in the capital of North Carolina, where he taught social sciences in 1920. During this time, the head of the North Carolina State Board of Charities and Public Welfare asked him to be the head of the new division of Negro Welfare in 1925. As director, Oxley made black organizations to help improve their community lives. He wanted to continue this work, so he eventually left teaching. When he left St. Augustine, over 40 counties had African American social workers. He was appointed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to be a part of Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. The cabinet was where 40 other African American leaders came together to serve as advisors during Roosevelt's administration. These cabinet members helped advise the president on issues like the New Deal and the Great Depression in ways to help African Americans. During this time period, African Americans had the highest unemployment rate and the first ones to get fired at their jobs because of their race. This cabinet was for African Americans to get better representation in the government. The cabinet was made sure that African Americans got at least 10% of welfare funds. Some programs that the New Deal had in place only benefited the white people. The cabinet also created jobs for unemployed African Americans. But even with these new jobs in place, African Americans still made up most of the unemployment rate. They were the first to get fired, then they would have to get back in the system to find another job. He studied the lives and social conditions of other African Americans. He developed and promoted social welfare programs that addressed issues such as job readiness and social functioning. He worked with other social workers to help strengthen the community. He mostly worked with unemployed, worked on improving health care, prison reform, and encouraged the development of statewide services for Blacks. He worked to improve employment opportunities for African Americans by publishing Government Employment and Negro Youth, which was about trying to get jobs for young African Americans and encourage the use of the U.S. employment services. He worked in the federal government for a few years as an advocate for the elderly. Working with the elderly helped to improve African Americans get hospital care and made orthopedic hospitals available to African Americans, which eventually led to the making of Medicare. He published multiple articles and reports to advocate for the Black community, most of them involving unemployment and the government and how African Americans impact the society. He was considered one of the most influential state welfare leaders of his time. He was involved in the NAACP, the National Urban League, and the National Conference of Christians and Jews. He eventually retired from the government work, but still remained interested in social issues. So he continued to help people in need and tried to better their lives. He pursued making a difference in African Americans' lives through social work until he passed away in 1973. This is a list of references that helped me during my research of Lawrence. Thank you all for listening.